science people! Today we are going to go more in depth into photosynthesis. There are two processes when it comes to photosynthesis. There is the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. This video is going to be on the light reaction. If you have not already, before watching this video, please watch my video on the summary of photosynthesis so you can understand the reactants and the products and everything going into photosynthesis. This is the second part of my photosynthesis videos. So today we will be talking about the light reaction. All right, let's jump right into it. So remember, we're in the organelle, the chloroplast, and within the chloroplast are all of these green discs called thylakoids. We saw that when we were talking about the summary of photosynthesis. And so the light reaction is happening in the thylakoids. More specifically, the majority of it happens within the membranes of the thylakoids. So when we look at this image, there's a lot of craziness going on here, all kinds of colors and distracting things. And you might look at this and go, nope, I'm out. I am not learning photosynthesis. But we can walk through this and we will make it make sense. Okay, so this is the membrane of the thylakoid. So this here's the membrane, and if you remember, membranes are phospholipid bilayers. Here's the phospholipid bilayer right here of the thylakoid membrane. In here, this green space, this is inside the thylakoid. This is inside, and this is the membrane. All of these things here embedded in the membrane, these are membrane proteins that help photosynthesis take place. They are helping the light reaction. So if you remember from our summary of photosynthesis, water is going to be what goes into the light reaction, and then oxygen is breathed out. So water is drank by the plant. The water goes into the thylakoid space. So here's that H2O. And then what's going to happen is the hydrogens are removed and the oxygens are breathed out of the plant. So the light reaction takes water in and breathes out oxygen. Okay, so we said the reason that plants want the H2O is really just because of the hydrogens. So that oxygen comes out and now we have hydrogens. Well, we have hydrogens now in this thylakoid space, but that's not enough. We now need to take hydrogen and separate the protons from the electrons. And if you remember your chemistry, a hydrogen atom is only one proton and only one electron. So what's going to happen is the protons and electrons are separated. The protons, the hydrogen protons, will stay in this thylakoid space. And so when we draw just a hydrogen proton, we call it an H plus because it has a positive charge. So all these H pluses are just hydrogen protons. And the goal is to fill the thylakoid space with as many hydrogen protons as possible. So we first get those hydrogen protons here. Well, now the electron is going to go through the membrane here, and we're going to talk about that process. Okay, so the electrons from the hydrogens will now enter what we call photosystem 2. Okay, now this is going to be annoying. The first process is photosystem 2. The second one is called photosystem 1. And you're like, wait, isn't this hard enough? Why does the second one happen first and the first one happen second? Well, it's because scientists discovered photosystem 1 first, then they discovered photosystem 2, and they just kept the names. But photosystem 2 is what happens first. So the electron goes into the photosystem 2. This electron right now is kind of a low energy electron, and then solar power, light, will hit photosystem 2. The sunlight hits the pigments, chlorophyll. These pigments are all in here, and so the sunlight bounces through all of these pigments, which absorb that energy, and then they transfer that energy to the electron. The electron gets excited and it jumps up to an electron acceptor. So solar energy hit photosystem 2, excited that electron, the electron jumped to an electron acceptor. Then the excited electron is transferred to an electron transport chain. This is electron transport chain 2. It's named after photosystem 2, so that way the numbers match. So photosystem 2, the electron then gets transferred to the electron transport chain 2. What is the purpose of the electron transport chain 2? Well, the electron transport chain 2 is going to try and pump in as many hydrogen protons into the thylakoid space as possible. Remember I said we want to create a lot of hydrogen protons in here. We will find out why in a little bit. So in order to pump hydrogen protons into here, you need energy to do that. Because if you guys remember diffusion and osmosis are when things go from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So in order to make a high concentration here, to bring protons from out here into a high concentration, if you're moving things from low to high, that requires energy. And so as this electron, this excited electron, goes down the electron transport chain, it's going to release its energy, and that energy will be used to pump more hydrogen protons into the thylakoid space. So the purpose of the electron transport chain 2 is to pump more protons into this space, and it gets that energy with this excited electron that goes through here. All right, now the electron is at photosystem 1, and it used up its little energy over here at electron transport chain 2. Now that the electron is at photosystem 1, it is now a low energy state right now. It will enter photosystem 1, and the same thing, solar light will bounce off of the pigments, exciting the electron. The electron will jump to an electron acceptor and then go into the electron transport chain 1. It's going to go through the electron transport chain 1, and it's going to wait for NADP plus to come pick it up. We remember NADP plus from our summary of photosynthesis. Okay, now let's go back to in the thylakoid space and talk about what all of these protons are doing. Well, remember, things want to go from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And so what we're trying to do is pack as many protons in here as possible, so that way they'll want to shove their way out of the thylakoid space. They want to go from high to low. Remember, we just call that diffusion. And so when protons are going from an area of high concentration to low concentration, we actually call this chemiosmosis, like chemical osmosis. Remember, osmosis is the diffusion of water. Well, chemiosmosis is the diffusion of protons. And so we filled this with as many protons as we can. Now they're going to want to shove their way out. They want to go from an area of high concentration out here where there's a low concentration of protons. And so those hydrogen protons are going to try and escape. And the only way for them to escape is going to be through this enzyme right here. This enzyme is called ATP synthase. It is called ATP synthase because it generates ATP. And so what happens is these hydrogens shove their way through the ATP synthase, and that pushing through the ATP synthase is going to power the generation of ATP. And so adenosine diphosphates, which were coming from the Calvin cycle, those adenosine diphosphates will then come over to ATP synthase along with some phosphates, and then the energy created while these protons shove their way through ATP synthase, that energy will be used in order to attach the extra phosphate to ADP in order to create ATP. And now that ATP will go to the Calvin cycle to power the Calvin cycle. And if you remember our summary of photosynthesis, I said the light reaction generates ATP that goes to power the Calvin cycle. So now we know how that ATP is generated. By creating a high proton concentration gradient here, chemiosmosis is going to be these protons pushing their way from high to low. They push their way through the ATP synthase, which then will help generate that ATP, which will go to the Calvin cycle to power the Calvin cycle. Okay, so now let's get back to this electron. Okay, so the electron went through the second electron transport chain in order to pump those protons in here, right? So we wanted to put more protons in there, and now we know why, to generate that ATP. Then that electron went down its concentration gradient of energy, and then it's going to get excited in the photosystem 1 and go through another electron transport chain, waiting for NADP plus to come take it to the Calvin cycle. So NADP plus, we said, was an energy carrier that carries hydrogen. So NADP plus is going to grab these protons, those hydrogen protons that all fell out of this ATP synthase. It's going to grab a hydrogen, grab the electron, making that hydrogen complete again. So NADP plus grabs the hydrogen proton, grabs the electron, and now it's NADPH. And now it can carry that hydrogen to the Calvin cycle. So if you remember our summary of photosynthesis, NADP plus comes to the light reaction, grabs hydrogens, and carries them to the Calvin cycle to be used to make sugar. And so here's how that's happening. So NADP plus grabs a hydrogen proton, grabs that energized electron, and as NADPH goes to the Calvin cycle. So this light reaction is going to generate our ATP for the Calvin cycle and take our high energy NADPH to carry hydrogens to the Calvin cycle. That is the whole point of this process. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video on the light reaction. The light reaction can be a complicated process, but hopefully this helped you understand it. In my next video, I will take on the Calvin cycle. I'll see you next time.